We are so honored to have you join us for this episode of Beyond the Loss. I'm Aditi Loveridge, bereaved parent to two and parent to one living child. I'm a specialized pregnancy and infant loss coach and founder of the registered charity, the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support Center.
And I'm Danielle Kaluski, bereaved parent to my daughter Emelina and parent to two living daughters. I am the co-founder and director of operations for the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support Center. On this show, we share real stories about parenting and healing through pregnancy and infant loss. We allow space for the often silenced truths around loss to be heard. We offer an affirmative space for all people impacted by loss to share their stories, their triumphs, and their healing.
Please remember that the stories shared are personal stories and are not to be used in replacement of professional advice. Please visit our charity link in the show notes for additional support should you need.
We are so excited to have you join us for today's episode. Let's start talking.
So welcome back to Beyond the Loss. Today we are joined by Melo Garcia. Melo is a grief specialist who assists those who have lost what isn't replaceable by creating After Chloe, an online community that provides support, resources, and assistance through the grief journey. After Chloe helps to find a way not only to process the pain of loss and grief, but to incorporate grieving and living to find a life after loss. Melo started and cultivated After Chloe in 2015 with the idea to give the griever a feeling of community and to know that what their options are, in fact, not only valid, but that anyone can create a roadmap to find their way after the loss. Melo created AfterChloe.com in honor of her daughter Chloe, who passed away in 2011 and after losing both of her parents. Melo felt it necessary to help others deal with the grief and losses life presents from death, divorce, identity, age, fertility, and empty nesting by creating various types of solutions that will assist you and inspire you to live and grieve. And most recently, Melo's the host of the new podcast, Resilience of Grieving. Thanks so much for being with us, Melo. We're so happy to finally be able to connect and have you on today.
Hi, ladies. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Yes, we're so excited. This has been a long time coming.
Yes, I feel so connected. I feel like you ladies are old friends.
I know, and we've only just met, so this is just the beginning, I believe.
Me too.
So normally, we ask all of our guests, would you mind sharing with our listeners a little bit about your personal journey and kind of what has led you here today?
Well, I always like to start out that there's two types of, there's many types of women, but there's two types of girls that I know. I'm a Mexican American woman, and the way I was raised is there was two types of Mexican girls, and there was the type of Mexican girl that they were like, I was meant to be a mom, and I wasn't that type of girl. I was like, I don't really want to get pregnant, and so I kind of avoided trying to get pregnant. And then I met my third husband. And I fell madly, deeply in love, twin soul, love of my life, all that good jazz. And we fell in love, and I knew I wanted to have a child with him. And, I guess my therapist could tell you the reasons why. I don't know if they were all healthy reasons, but they were reasons. And so we then started to try to have a baby. And I realized quickly that I had some fertility issues, and I had a miscarriage. And when I had a miscarriage, I was told, you miscarried. And it was very clinical. It was very cold. It was very earth-shattering. And I felt like there was a part of me missing, but I never discussed it. It just kind of went on. And then about 6 or 7 months later, I found out that I was pregnant again. That was an ectopic pregnancy, and which means the fetus went through my fallopian tube. I was told again, very clinically, I was given an injection because otherwise they would have had to remove one of my fallopian tubes. And so the fetus passed, which was my baby. And I was sent home again from the hospital. And I was very confused that there was nothing available in terms of resources to help me process my feelings about all of this. And all the while, my husband, my spouse at the time, was very uncertain and unable to process it either. And so, kind of the farther apart we came. And maybe about, I want to say 12 weeks later, we got a call, and my father had been in the restroom and he wouldn't come out. And he died from a cardiac aneurysm. And it was very sudden. So at the time we were living in Las Vegas, Nevada, we came back to California, and I had to take care of my mother. She had had a massive heart attack. My mom and dad had been married for almost 43 years, 3 days shy of 43 years. So all this was going on, and I started to get symptoms of being pregnant. And I, sure enough, was pregnant. And we hadn't started IVF. So it was like, a miracle. And so I was pregnant, and I was pregnant and I was a high risk. I was considered to be quote unquote geriatric at 34 years old. And I was put on complete bed rest while I'm trying to take care of my mother. My father had just died. And I was in California. My husband was in Las Vegas. So in December, I begged the doctor to let me go home to Las Vegas. I was very homesick, and my mother had been put back into the hospital. So they let me go home, and I went home. I remember we spent Christmas evening, me and my baby, who at the time I thought was going to be a boy. We were watching The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, and we ate Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I was so excited. And that next day I started having labor pains. Long story short, I went to the ER. They told me it was a UTI, and I was sent home. And that's all I really remember. But my water broke. I went into a psychosis of sorts, and my dad was sitting across from me on the couch, and he was like, "Your baby's going to die." And so my husband found me, and he took me to the emergency room, and sure enough, my water had broke. And they took me into the living room, and they said, "Your baby's probably not going to make it through the evening." And my baby was born at 1.9 pounds. And my baby that I thought was going to be a boy turned out to be Chloe Carolyn Garcia. And I saw her, and it was over from there. I fell madly, deeply in love. And she was transferred to another hospital because they didn't have a NICU unit in Las Vegas where I was. So she was in one hospital, I was in another, and my husband went to be with her. I was kept in the hospital because I was pretty sick. I had had a kidney infection. And so she lived in the NICU for about 57 days. She ended up dying of NEC. She died on February 22nd. And I think me and her dad died that day as well. I then took care of my mom for another year, and then my mom passed away. And I was lost. I went to 14 different therapists. No one spoke grief. And I decided that I was going to understand grieving. And I started to study it. And I'd already had my bachelor degrees. And so I went back to school. I got my master's in marriage and family counseling. And I studied every possible piece of information I could get on grief and loss. And all the while, I couldn't find myself. And me and Chloe's dad separated, and I was broken, and I started after Chloe. And I think for a really long time after Chloe filled that void of having a baby or having something to live for, if that makes sense. Like I wasn't really living for myself. And then I got really serious about getting healthy and well. And that was in 2017 that I really worked on myself. Chloe had passed away in 2011. And I really worked on myself and getting well and just my journey. And in 2018, me and Chloe's dad reconciled. And, I've been on the path. I think there was definitely a hiccup this past year in 2020 when COVID hit. And it's definitely kind of derailed the thought process of all that's happened. It's definitely been triggering to everything that we as a human race has experienced, to understanding grief and loss at a human level. But yeah, that's just kind of in a nutshell my story.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. There's so much of your story that even though I've been following you for so long, there's so much in that story that I don't think I was aware of. There was a couple of things there that you said that I thought that I would like to follow up with. I recently on my Instagram wrote about my partner and I separating during COVID, just because we hadn't really addressed the grief that was between us since our two losses, and we are now reconciling. We're working towards reconciliation. And you said that you and Chloe's dad did reconcile. Can you tell us, because I think this is something that people don't talk about. It's the finding your way back to one another, if that makes sense. Like, what is that process like for the two of you? Because I think this is something that is so hard to navigate that it's nice to hear when people actually talk about it, if that makes sense.
I fell so in love with him. Like I used to adore like the ground he would walk on. I just loved him. And I never loved anyone like that besides my mom and then obviously Chloe. And I never thought I could love someone outside of my mom that way, to give myself that freely, that openly, and that trust and that bond, to have that with another person. Like I'd look at my parents and the marriage and the relationship that they had, and I thought I was never going to have that. So when Chloe died, I lost it. I was no longer who I had been. And for a long time, I kept trying to go back to who I was. And it makes me a little emotional because I miss her so much. I miss myself. I miss the girl I was. I miss the woman I was. I miss that girl. I miss the way I used to look at him. I miss her. And I searched for her versus trying to find who I had become and making peace with that. So a lot of time was spent grappling with that. And in my culture, as a Mexican American woman, there was a lot of pressure to try again. And there was a lot of fallout in terms of that. I just really didn't feel anything for a really long time. I remember, in fact, where I'm sitting right now is where I would sit and I would open my mouth and nothing would come out. And I would just feel so much rage and I couldn't get it out. And so the only person that I could freely take it out on was him. When my mom died, and he had been the only person there taking care of my mom, besides obviously nursing staff and so forth, but he was the only person there with me. He was there the whole time. And I really forgot and was unable to give him support. And he, being a Mexican American man, he didn't have the tools or the ability to say, hey, let's go to counseling. Now we're in counseling, but back then he didn't know what to do with me. And so I was such a wreck in terms of like, I couldn't go forward. I couldn't go backwards. I couldn't go side to side. I was just frozen. And so it's impossible to stay in a relationship like that with anyone. And not to say that he didn't play his part, because he'd have to say what his part was, but we grew so far apart that we couldn't come back together. That grief and that loss built a barrier, yes, but I think I put the final barrier because I no longer participated. I didn't care. I didn't want it. I didn't want to be here. And so how did we come back is that I had to really get honest about that. And I had to really decide, was I going to just exist in this life and talk about life after loss, and you can grieve your way, and that's all true, but was I going to do the soul work that I needed to really meet Mello after losing my child and both of my parents? Was I going to do the work I needed to do to really figure out what I wanted in a partner, if I wanted a partner? And so all of those things had to align. And obviously, I think with going through losing a child, there has to be that foundation of love. And I do believe that we really loved each other, but that wasn't enough. And so we've been through, what most people don't even go through in a lifetime. We've been through like what most people go through in 10 lifetimes, because there's a lot of things that happened in between. But I think it's about forgiveness. I think it's about I no longer hold him accountable for anything that's happened. And I've forgiven myself first and foremost. And so that's how we came back together. And now we can grieve together. There's so many couples that I know in this space that they're like, we grieve together and we light candles together. That was not me and Chloe's dad. Like, I'd be like, get away from me. She's my daughter. Don't talk about her. And, he sleeps with her ashes. And a big part of our separation or divorce, the biggest fight we had, and this will make me start crying, was he didn't want anything. He just wanted her ashes. And I was so mad because I was like, why? You're just doing that to hurt me. And he was like, no, I just love our daughter. I just want her ashes. I can't be without Chloe, please. Like, that's all I want from this. And it's funny because for Mother's Day, he bought me a ring and he had some of her ashes put in it. And that's such growth for us, because in our religion, in our culture, we don't do things like that. And one of the promises that I made to Chloe as she was dying was, I promise to always love your dad, Chloe. And I think those are the biggest reasons why I think we've come back together at peace.
There's so much in there that you said that just hit me in all the feels, and a lot of things that really resonated for me personally. And wow, like, all he wanted was Chloe's ashes. Like that, yeah, I can see why that would make you emotional, because I was holding back tears myself. Like, it sounds like, to get back together, there was a lot of like honesty that had to happen for you in particular, for both of you, but for you in particular to really like do the work, if that makes sense, which I think a lot of people avoid that work. And so we get further disconnected from those around us. For you, because you mentioned that quite a bit. Like, I had to go back, had to actually start to examine like who this Mellow is, not who she once was. What did that process actually look like for you?
I had to get really self-aware. I didn't understand that I couldn't go back to who I had been prior to the losses. I had to understand that that's okay. I had to understand that it's okay to grieve. It's okay to live. I had to understand that there's not a betrayal in living after loss. And I had to come to terms with it's okay to seek out support. I've always felt kind of like a lone ranger. I know we were kind of talking about the pregnancy and infant loss community prior to coming on recording. And I've always felt like I didn't belong. And I've always talked about that in therapy. And I think it's because I never really wanted to have children, and to really get in depth into that, I think I never thought I deserved it, because I had such amazing parents, and my mother was like the mother, the mother of all mothers. She was a superstar, and that went back to her not having such a great mom, and my mom did it all. She just was amazing. And so that was a lot to live up to, and that scared me. And so all those, environmental, generational things that came down to it when I failed, and not that it was a failure, but at the time in my head, I failed. My child died. That's my fault. Those were the thoughts that would go through my head daily. I couldn't get out of those thoughts. And so I really had to reframe that thinking. And I also had to go through the process of the pain. And I had to go through the process of being in bed all day. I had to go through the process of really suffering and grieving and crying and understanding that wherever I was, it was okay. And wherever I wasn't, it was okay. And when I did all of that and looking in the mirror to say, I really don't like you, and that was okay. And then really looking in the mirror and saying, hey, I really like you, and that was okay. And then saying, what do I have the power to change? And what do I have the power to fix to the best of my ability? And I really just started to chip away at what I could change and to be the healthiest, best version of myself at my rate of speed, and to do the things I could do to love myself daily as my mom would love me, or as Chloe would love me, or as my dad would love me. And when I started to make healthy, kind, loving decisions towards myself, everything started to change in the way that I grieved. And a lot of people will hear me and go, well, does your grief just disappear? No, it's something that I live with every single day. It's not easy to talk about my daughter's death or my parents' death daily, but it's cathartic in the way that I know that I also have a great balance where later on today, I'm going to watch Handmaid's Tale or Cruel Summer or whatever my favorite TV show is, and eat Ben and Jerry's. And I'm going to go for a walk with my, my puppy son Cholo that thinks he's the boss and I instead of me. And I have a balance in my life where before I didn't have any balance or any structure to my life.
You really hit some stuff on the nail, Mellow, when you were talking about, just being kind and being healthy. A lot of your story resonates personally with me and what I've shared on the podcast, where I was very similar to you. I either didn't want to deal with the grief or I was like heavy into the grief. However, you said that you needed to forgive yourself. And wow, that is exactly how I felt. I had to forgive myself and really lean into it. So thank you for sharing and being so real.
No, thank you. Thank you for giving me the ability to.
This is the interesting thing, is the more that like I'm in this space and the more that work that we do in this space, it's how like the common thread is how we all feel like we're alone. And then each guest we have on, or the more I talk to clients, or it's like there's so much that resonates in your story and mine, like just so many things. Like I also did not want to have children. That's what I thought. One of my first loss was an ectopic pregnancy, and I remember when they said I was losing that baby and I lost that baby, for me it solidified, actually I do want children. But there was a lot of like guilt and grappling with that notion of, well, you said you didn't really want to have children, and what that means. And it's just so interesting how many parallels and overlaps like stories do have, where our journeys are so unique, but it really solidifies for me how much we're actually not alone. And that's my big takeaway. And I hope that anyone listening to our podcast, to Mello's podcast, to all the beautiful podcasts that are out there, is that when we're in the thick of our grief, we feel completely alone. And then when we can step outside of that, we realize how interconnected we all are. And so I have a question, Mello, is that so many of our listeners, so many of the community, when they've experienced loss basically of any kind, they worry that they will never feel anything other than the pain and the grief and anger and the loss. Can you discuss a little bit about the movement of those feelings?
I think that movement is such a powerful word that describes grief and loss. We tend to think we're supposed to get over, or that there's going to be this big moment that we feel differently. Like even when you hear someone like me, or you hear either of you ladies, it's like this big combustion, right? Or you get, when you get a package in the mail and you get really excited, or you get an email and you're like, oh my gosh, it's Nordstrom. Nordstrom's really big here in the States. You're like, oh my gosh, Nordstrom's anniversary sale. You get excited to see what's there. It's not like that. It's more quiet. It's almost when you wake up and you're like, oh, it's Sunday, I don't have anything to do. It's calm. Or it could be like, wow, I opened an email and I'm getting 20% off at my favorite store. Or, it's like, wow, I'm going to go eat at my favorite restaurant. It's a feeling of whatever you need it to be. But a lot of times we think that if we're not grieving, we're somehow abandoning our loved one, our child, our loss, our baby. And that's not the truth. That's our shame and our betrayal and our inability to understand that connection to our child is always going to be there, no matter what. And when I understood that Chloe is a part of me, regardless of after Chloe, regardless of, I am not talking to you as after Chloe today. I'm talking to you as Mello, as Chloe's mom. One day a girl came to me and she said, it's really easy for you because you are, after Chloe, and you have this and you can do this. And I was like, no, like, in fact, it's worse because there's a pressure, and I grieve too. I have feelings too. And to be honest with you, I've talked more about the loss of Chloe in the last probably 2 years than I ever have, because I wasn't able to process it. It was only when I was able to move through those feelings that I could start to discuss it. And it was because me and Chloe's dad were barely getting there. And so when you start to move through your grief, there's no timeline. It doesn't mean it goes away. It just means that you're moving through it, and it'll come back. It doesn't mean that it's going to be crying. It may be laughing. It may be anger. It may be, I need to go run 5 miles. God bless you. I'm not going to be there with you, but I'll be cheering for you on the sidelines. but you're going to have to move through that. And so whatever that means for you, I hope that means that you'll feel it and understand that it's okay to be sad. It's okay to feel upset. It's okay to feel like your heart's going to fall out of your chest. It's okay to feel hysterical, but there's so many amazing resources where you're not alone in this. And that's where you've got to understand it's okay to ask for help. Yes, it's your singular journey of grief and loss. No one is going to feel what you feel, but you don't have to be alone in this.
Yeah, that I think that's so powerful. And I've never actually thought of, as soon as you said like the movement, I actually, because even when I speak, I always use that word, like allow yourself to move through this. And I've actually never thought of the word itself, but I think you explain that so beautifully. It is a movement. And I think that word is so powerful in the description of living with life and loss, because it does ebb and flow and there is a movement to it. And I've actually never made that connection in the power within that word. So thank you for that. That was like when you said that, that was like a light bulb, because I've always used that word, but never really thought of why.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, it's a very powerful word.
It really is. And I think it really helps for grieving people to stop having that like rigidity in the mindset of like, well, now we're here and now we're there. Right? Like,
Right.
I think, yeah, I think you just explained that so beautifully. I think that gives a lot of, it makes people feel very empowered when they are in the sadness, when they are in those feels, to know that there's a movement and that it's okay to be there, because you'll also move out of it. And then it's okay when you dip back in, because you'll also dip back out. But it's like this beautiful, I don't know, I just saw like, it's like river of like flow. And I think it describes the grief journey so eloquently.
Yes, absolutely. I agree.
And I think there's something else you shared that I want to highlight, Mello, and that is that you said that 2 years ago that you started kind of working through this and you're kind of able to speak. I think from my experience that there's a lot of pressure put on to move through the years, so that, by the time you're at year 3, you should be doing X. And by the time you're at year 5, you should be doing X. And you're you're 10 years out in your grief journey. Is that about right?
Yes. Yeah. Chloe died in 2011. And I don't like to put time structure on loss. I mean, I think that for me, I just never felt comfortable talking about what I hadn't come through, right? And so when I'm talking about grief and loss, I feel really good talking about the loss of my parents, because I can tell you I've moved through it. With Chloe, it's consistently where I'm moving through it, but like it's 5 steps forward and like 20 steps back. It was 5 steps forward and then it was like 10,000 steps back. And I think it's because there are constantly milestones with Chloe that are continuously happening, kindergarten, I mean, you name it, there's triggers. And so what I had to really learn, and I apologize because I know I interrupted you, is that I had to learn that those triggers were also opportunities for me to move through as well. But I too, like you were about to talk about, is that I would think I've got to be here by year number, whatever. Right. And because I'm after Chloe. And then I was like, you know what? And I won't drop any F-bombs, ladies, but I dropped
You can go. You're okay to swear.
I get scared. I'm like, are you guys religious? No, but I won't drop any F-bombs, but I dropped a few and I'd be like, no, F-bomb that. I'm not going to do that today because I'm not going to live off anybody's timeline. And the only timeline I live off of are my 2 pit bulls, Cholo and Brother, because they like to make accidents in the house. But otherwise, I don't live off of anybody's timeline. So I had to really stop that. So I mentioned 2 years ago because that's when I really started to own my grief in terms of Chloe, to be like, you know what? I am going to talk about how Chloe's dad and I are falling apart at the seams, even though it's going to upset our Mexican family and it's going to cause disarray. Because let me tell you, that is a whole other story. But I'm gonna share my truth, and so I had to get comfortable, but I never measured it by time, if that makes sense.
No, and I think that's something that I had to learn myself, was stop measuring it by time and start measuring it by emotion.
Yes, I love that. So beautiful, Danielle. Yeah, I can really resonate with that.
Because, my daughter passed away very close to when your daughter did. My daughter passed away on the 21st, the year later, so 2012. So, just even the fact that you're being honest about your relationship, it's something that wasn't, I heard all the stats, about separation and divorce and all these other things, but nobody was honest in, hey, my relationship is faltering because we're grieving differently. Because I was there. Although we didn't separate, I was there with I wasn't dealing with my grief. My husband was dealing with his grief differently. And so although I don't have a Mexican culture, I have a very European culture that my husband is part of. And so that played a lot to do with how we grieved and how honest we were with what we were dealing with and what we hid behind closed doors. So I want to thank both you and Aditi for being so honest about your relationships and and that you struggled, because you're making it normal, that it's okay for us to struggle, not just with our emotions, but with our relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I think my culture had huge repercussions on our grief process, on our relationship, on the pressures of what transpired, and it ended up well, but by the reception of how after Chloe's been received, it really concerns me that so many humans are out there without a life, what do they call them, life vests, like, they don't have resources where they're willing to go against the grain of what they've been taught to believe. And so, my parents passed away, but my parents instilled in me, my grandfather worked in the fields and was an illegal, quote unquote, alien, as, the United States call, people that are not American citizens. They called them aliens, for God's sake. I mean, and he was not immigrated, and so he worked in the fields his whole life. And so my grandfather, not my great grandfather, my grandfather, and so my mother, I didn't know race until I met my Chloe's dad. And so Chloe's grandparents are very, very, very traditionally Mexican. And so it was not until last year that my sister-in-law, their daughter, who's only 2 years older than me, she passed away due to COVID. And so that really changed the dynamic of grief. And unfortunately, it took that catastrophic event to bring empathy, and it was really hard for me to embrace that. Obviously, I love my sister-in-law, and I've dealt with my own grief, and watching Chloe's dad, it's been very difficult. And thankfully, we're at the place we are now. But prior to that, there was so much fallout. So I get where other humans are struggling to allow their grief to be heard and felt due to racism, due to cultural restraints, due to feeling pressures of religious constraints, due to God's punishing me. This is God's punishment, and I don't mean to be glib by, I'm not laughing. I'm almost crying, because why would anyone think that? But this is what society says, not what we're saying. We're the minority, not the majority. I'm hoping that this will change.
Yeah. Yes, me too. And that's why we're just so grateful, Mello, for your time and your honesty and your presence in the grief community. I think just having you here and talking so openly is a step for that change, I believe. Okay, so my goodness, I could literally talk to you forever, like forever and ever. Perhaps we will do another episode, because there's so many things that you said that I would love to dive deeper into. So if you're open to coming on again, Mello, we would love to have you on again.
Yes, definitely. I mean, anytime. You ladies are so amazing what you're doing. So amazing. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to collaborate with you ladies, and whatever you need from me. And I mean, I'm excited to see what you girls do next.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. We so appreciate you and all that you do for the community, and yeah, just all of it. And I'm really excited as well to see how this grows. We like to ask our guests a question. We ask our guests the same question at the end of every episode, and that is, knowing what you know now, what would you tell yourself then?
I'm like, oh my gosh, to comb my hair. No. I was just thinking of my hair back then. Yeah. Girl, comb your hair.
Oh, I love that.
Myself right now, it's not comb right now. Oh gosh, I think I would give myself a big hug, and I would tell myself, even though it's not okay without Chloe and your mom in the world with you, they're with you. And you are going to move through this and do it as gently as you can, and love yourself through all of it.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. We are so grateful to have had you on. I got so many things from this conversation, and thank you for sharing about your journey. You are a real testament to how there is loss in our lives, and there's also living past those losses, and with those losses. So thank you so much for being on today. We will have where our listeners can find you in the show notes when this goes live. And so, because I know that there's going to be many people who would like to connect with you. And so thank you so much once again, Mello, for coming on. And we will hopefully have you back on and have some more conversations. I'm pretty sure that will happen.
Thank you, Aditi. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate you.
Thank you. And we'll see you next time on Beyond the Loss.
Thank you, ladies.